Thank you, John. Good morning and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event on promoting renewable energy. So while the title of the event speaks of renewable energy, you can see that we are looking at one of the most critical areas, how to balance the grid when you have large quantum of renewable energy being mainstreamed into the country. And we are very fortunate at the start of the Indian festive season, we have an August panel and a large audience this evening and this morning. I'd like to welcome you all. I'm Raghav Upadhyay from the US India Business Council. This is part of the USIBC Digital Week, and we have had 3 days of wonderful conferences and events on a range of issues, which includes 5G, it includes artificial intelligence, quantum computing, agriculture, and agri-tech. So, looking at all of this, I'm very optimistic about the future, even though these may be very pessimistic times as such. And this particular event, we hope, virtue of a participation at this event, we will be able to look into and emerge with some greater clarity on the areas that we need to work on going forward, mainstream large amounts of renewable energy into the grid. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's helped put this event together and to thank our speakers. I'd like to start by introducing our inaugural speaker, Sharmila Bharathan from General Secretary from GE. Thank you so much. You could join us, Sharmila. And very briefly, Sharmila, uh, you know,
Hey, Raghav, just before we do that, could everyone not speaking or on the panel please go on mute because there's a lot of static, which is there's an echo. So if you're not speaking, just please go on mute. Go ahead, Raghav.
thank you, Abhishek. So, to introduce Sharmila, Sharmila is President, Government Affairs and Policy Affairs at GE South Asia. She has 30 years of international experience in policy, regulation, and climate change from Europe to South East Asia. She was a contributing author to the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She was a reviewer at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Steering Group. As a board member and as a wonderful person, a great help, source of guidance, I welcome you, Sharmila. I welcome our keynote speaker too, and hand it over now to Sharmila to give the powerful address to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Mr. S.
Thank you, Raghav. One of the partnerships that GE has had the honor to build over the decades is this one with the US Chamber and USIBC. As part of the global board, GE values the collective strength that 200 US and Indian industry.
Once the product has been developed and is ready for manufacturing,
Sharmila, could you unmute yourself again, please? We had to mute everyone just to ensure that there was no echo.
Is this better?
Absolutely. Please.
Yes, thank you. So as part of the global board, GE values the collective strength that the 200 US and Indian industry leaders bring, serving as the voice of industry linking governments to businesses. So thank you, USIBC, for your partnership and this opportunity. This webinar is timely and consequential as India continues on its strong renewables growth trajectory towards a target of 175 gigawatts by 2022 and 450 gigawatts by 2030, thereby making grid integration critical. Now, with this capacity buildup of renewables, there will be implications for grid planning and operations as the fundamental intermittency and stochasticity of renewables become a challenge. Flexibility can help address the variability and uncertainty associated with the increasing share. And towards this end, the government of India has put in place a draft policy for the supply of round-the-clock power firm power to discoms, which would be a blend of power from renewables and from thermal. And GE is of the view that given India's ambitious renewable energy targets, there's a role for key technology solutions, and this could be coal, gas, or battery storage for balancing the grid. And the resource mix would be chosen on the basis of optimal performance, good project economics, depending on the site conditions. Now, for instance, the inclusion of gas turbine technology for the purpose of grid balancing will have the benefits including minimum startup time, faster ramp up and ramp down. And this technology can dovetail the variability of wind and solar in providing constant output into the grid without additional costs, and is optimal for smoothing out spikes and dips caused by the mismatch between renewable energy generation and demand. And in addition to these would also be ideal for being used as a spinning reserve and for meeting peaking power and frequency control requirements. Now, storage solutions may be considered, in combination with renewable hybrid solution. Given that SECI has already come out with an round-the-clock tender bundling renewable energy with coal-based power and storage, I think it's equally important for them to include one with renewables and gas in the RTC tenders as part of their grid firming effort. And this would ensure a level playing field for all technology solutions. And and this would include both new assets with the latest gas turbine technology and the currently stranded assets. So, as renewable generators explore options to balance fluctuating grid demand to avoid congestion or surplus, data analytics and digital solutions are being increasingly deployed to ensure greater operational efficiencies. And for instance, GE's digital wind farms have a digital twin that uses historical data and real-time telemetry to predict asset failure, extend life of the asset, and keep minor problems from turning into major ones. So with that, and in the interest of time, I'm actually going to conclude my introductory remarks, and I'd like to invite Mr. Soonee to deliver the keynote address. Mr. Soonee is the advisor and former CEO of POSOCO, with decades of experience covering technical, commercial, regulatory, you name it, and he's done that. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Soonee, but not just welcoming, but having the opportunity to learn from his rich experience on integration of grids, whether it's at the national grid level or at the SARC grid. Welcome, Mr. Soonee.
Thank you very much, Sharmila ma'am. Yeah, thanks USIBC for this opportunity. We have a very rich panel which will discuss all these issues. I can see David from NREL, Mr. Stephen, rooftop specialist, Rick will be moderating, and Dr. Dam from ZIZ. So they were all super specialists. I will try to paint a big picture of what's happening in this particular area. Two words are being talked about wherever is the webinar or seminar or whatever it may be: climate change and COVID. And COVID is a trailer of what climate change is going to be. So Government of India policy is very loud and clear. You heard Sharmila ma'am saying 175, 100 solar, 60 wind, and all these numbers are everybody, every child knows these numbers. But now these numbers have been raised to 450, and all of us are working towards this policy, these numbers. There are efforts from all sides, be it on technical side, be it on the regulatory side, be it on the market side. Let me try to dwell upon each of them very quickly. I won't take much time of yours. you would like to listen to the panelists more. So the regulators, the way the construction is going on, regulators are also coming after one regulations and matching with the policies. One of the most important regulations which have been put in place in India on RE is its scheduling mechanism and deviation mechanism, the connection codes, and the same is getting replicated at the state level. I consider these regulations to be landmark regulations. With these regulations in place, now RE has access to the entire India. You can connect at interstate level and sell at any place. On the technical front, a lot of work is going on. The grid code is getting completely revamped, particularly keeping RE in mind. The draft is already available on the CRC website. We would very soon have a discussion on that. IEGC 2020, I think anybody who is interested in RE must keep track of that. On the market front, after 1 decade of market development in India, we would be having a revamped regulation on market. We had public hearing of market regulation only last month. Notwithstanding all being locked down, still, the warriors have put in new products in the market. Real-time market with effect from 1st June has come into operation. This again is keeping renewables in mind, better balancing, and more opportunity for the stakeholders. Flexibility, as Sharmila mentioned, is the word which we repeat again and again. We keep on chanting flexibility. And the flexibility has to be defined, has to be measured, matrix have to be there, it has to be paid, it has to be incentivized. It's very easy to say flexibility, but real implementation in the field is a very, very daunting task. We are trying to introduce flexibility in thermal power plants. 55% is already there, 40% is being attempted. A lot of studies have been done by GIZ. Pilot plants are there, and not only in thermal, hydro, and gas, even power transmission also, a lot of flexibility. India is very fortunate to have a dozen HVDCs and 2 dozens of FACTS controller, SVCs and STATCOMs. So flexibility is being given the highest value. I may add here, as an engineer, I was always made to think over the efficiency part of it. Now flexibility has crossed efficiency. Given the 2 things, flexibility and efficiency, I would pick up flexibility first. Now, besides real-time product, we know the ancillary, though it's not a market-based, but still the ancillary has come into place. And now for every 15 minutes, the operator can dispatch is of the order of 2,000 to 3,000 megawatt very easily. And along with ancillary, security constrained economic dispatch, pan-India, is going on for every 15 minutes. It causes merit order, it takes care of ramping, and a lot of learning we have. These are a pilot project, but I would say it's only for the namesake pilot. It's almost full rollout. Its maturity level has gone up in the last 2 years, maybe to TRL level 9. So over the years, now more and more plants have been included, and we have learned how to do this. Grid is being made more strong, and that's the USP. If again, out of everything of the basket of solutions for renewable integration, if somebody asks me to pick up one, I will pick up the grid. It has huge advantages. It's really a delight, economics delight, and a dream for us to have single price pan India, not for 1 or 2 hours, but for days together, months together. And that's something which will help us in integrating renewables for sure. Standards is something which worries us. Standards and compliance is a very serious matter. When it was a small component of RE, that was different. But once we are talking of a higher level of penetration, be it LVRT, be it reactive power, and all those things, I will not dwell upon it. There are specialists who know about it. But the inner standards and its compliance would be definitely stepped up after this grid code comes into place. Inertia is, again, we are conscious and aware of it. A lot of studies are going on. After all, it's a matter of 7 to 8 seconds. That's all the inertia is about. And how do we get synthetic inertia? What more we need to do? The largest credible contingencies? How much reserve has to be increased? All these things specialists are working. You may not find a lot of material in the public domain, but I assure that the right people are spending time on that. Now, as far as the energy is concerned, the grid has always and would always accept all kinds of new technologies. Like an orchestra, one instrument can come, one instrument goes out, another instrument comes in. But the orchestra has to produce symphony all the time, be it thermal, hydro, gas, wind, solar, nuclear, offshore wind, and I mean, name it. We are looking at each of them, and we would be welcoming as grid any kind of energy. It will come storage, whether it is closed loop hydro pump storage, or even chemical storage, or other kind of storage, replacement of wire. And we know about all the technology which is going on and preparing the grid to take care of this. Another aspect is cross-sector coupling. The background, the layer below this electricity grid, be it gas, be it coal, and even water, that's also equally important, and a lot of work is going on. How do we synergize between gas grid and electricity grid? And I understand the regulators on all the sites are working on this. One of the biggest strengths of India is huge diversity. We have in the load around 6% of diversity. We have diversity in the exchanges, in the climate, and I can list out at least a dozen of diversities which we are harnessing through the grid. The wind of Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan, at times are complementary. Solar and wind, there is a correlation which is being found out. So all these things are the strength, and India is the place. India, it's time. It's a happening time, happening place. And we are now looking forward to cross-border. Cross-border policies have come out. Regulations are also in place, and a lot of pushes on cross-border. And not only the expansion of the grid, but even allowing them to bid in the Indian market. That would be a major paradigm shift as far as the neighbors are concerned. And all of you know about OSOWOG, One Sun, One World, One Grid, International Solar Alliance. And I can only say that when I was very young, I had just joined 78. At that time, India had 40 frequencies. And gradually all of them have been integrated. In 78, the 2-page paper was produced that India should have one grid. It was ridiculed. That's not possible. How would you invest so much? But lakhs and lakhs of crores have been invested. And today we have a solid, robust, strong grid. So I'm sure that gradually it will go up. And large footprint is an essential part for renewable integration. You get advantage of diversity and all other things. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity. I am sure that the panel discussion would be very enriching, and I don't want to take more time than this. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Soonee, sir. It was wonderful to have that, broad overarching, and yet within this overarching overview that you've given, you've gone into deep dives into very critical areas. Thank you for this wonderful address. And just so that everyone knows, so Mr. Soonee, in addition to having set up and created POSOCO, so POSOCO is the national grid operator of India. It operates the national and the regional grids. In addition to that, Mr. Soonee is also very well known for his work in the power markets, reform of power markets, in various kind of market optimization, not just limited to power, but other markets as well, the gas market and all. And I hope that all of these markets, as we're evolving, sir, will continue to draw on your learning, and that we can call on and draw on this particular from this knowledge base of yours, excellent knowledge base of yours. So thank you so much, sir. I understand you have a hard stop, but as long as you'll be here, I'll be requesting our panel to draw upon your experience for as long as you're here on the panel. Moving on, I'd like to introduce, sir, to you and to the rest of our wonderful audience over here, our moderator for the panel discussion tonight or this morning, Rick Rossow. So Rick is no stranger to USIBC, having served at USIBC for many years, and he played a very crucial part of the role years ago. So thank you so much, Rick, that you're able to join us. So to introduce you, Rick, you're Senior Director, McLarty Associates, and you're a member of USIBC, so you've crossed over to the other side. You're also the Wadhwani Chair, Representative Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at CSIS, that is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And in this role, you focus on shaping US economic engagement with India in India's reform process, and you track India's state-level political economies. And Rick, you've been a leader in the private sector efforts to increase market access and resolve investor disputes and take advantage of new business opportunities in India since 1998. Welcome indeed, Rick, and I'm so glad you could join us this morning despite all the technical issues you're having at that end. May I also introduce David Palchak. David, if you could turn on your camera, please. So David is an engineer in the Strategic Energy Analysis Center at NREL, the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory. David's work addresses the challenges associated with RE integration in the bulk power system, and that has involved multiple stakeholder-driven projects on both the east and western interconnections of North America, as well as in India. So David is very familiar, is a thorough expert in the US as well as the India side, just like Rick, in his own domain. And we are so fortunate that we could have you here, David. We also understand that you've led two very well-known studies, including a renewable energy integration study for the Indian grid. And there are other studies also that you're working on. I'm glad you could join us here, David. Finally, we have Stephen Fernands. Last but by no means least, Stephen is a very familiar face here in India as also in the US. Again, Stephen is very familiar with both countries, having worked very closely for so many years with stakeholders in both countries. And Stephen's Customized Energy Solutions, which is a company that he founded, helps understand wholesale and retail electric and natural gas and implement solutions through software platforms. So I'm so glad you could join us here, Stephen. We look forward to the panel discussions and the interactions that follow. Over to you, Rick.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, it really is really exciting for me to be here, helping launch the USIBC office about 20 years ago, and then relaunching it after the dot-com collapse when we had to close it down for a brief period. So it is cool to be full circle. I think when we think about India's energy scenario, it has been a whirlwind 6.5 years. Now, in my role, both at McLarty and CSIS, I have the opportunity to really sort of study and look at most sectors of the Indian economy. And I can honestly say, not just speaking to this audience, but no part of the economy has seen as much change as the energy sector has. I mean, just think about these initiatives that the Modi government has laid out in the 6.5 years they've been in office. You've got the Uday program to try to bail out the broken distribution companies. You've got this 175 gig renewable target, the Saubhagya initiative to try to deliver electricity to every village and every home. The major oil and gas reforms, which I don't hear discussed quite as much, but have offered a significant new regulatory regime for companies to develop oil and gas. The coal reforms, I mean, each one of these, would be a once in an administration kind of tasking to take on and try to improve and work on. And the Modi government has tried to do all of them simultaneously. And it's not to say that they've succeeded or met all their objectives and all these simultaneously, because there are inherent pushes and pulls when you're trying to reform the grid, but also expanding the grid to the most heavily subsidized consumers. When you're trying to open up oil and gas and coal at the same time as trying to meet this massive renewable energy target the government has set. So doing all these things simultaneously has also shown some real frictions and fissures to some extent. But two terrific experts that I get to help to work with on this panel to share, some of the crucial elements that are happening related to the renewable energy target. We know the pressures that you face state governments in India, keeping prices at ultra low levels, trying to expand access, trying to improve reliability, but at the same time, this real tough price cap that ultimately voters have chosen to see, where you see state governments that have taken hard decisions on electricity have tended to be voted out of office. So, as India is trying to do all these things simultaneously, what is the role for innovation in the energy grids, where you can help keep prices at a point that are politically sustainable, but also improve access and reliability while decarbonizing the environment? So can't think of two better folks that I get to lean on. And frankly, I'm going to be taking probably more notes than anybody else in the audience as I try to get myself smarter on these issues. Let me kick it first over to David. Great two times in just a few months here that I get to lean on David and try to pick his brain to make myself and our audience smarter. David, let's just start with the biggest questions first. Renewable energy integration. A lot of big targets out here, a lot of states government working on it right now. But there's been difficulties and sometimes thinking about how you integrate renewables into the grids that exist right now. What are some of the difficult issues that you've seen with state governments trying to integrate renewables in areas where companies that are on the line right now can think about technology as a service and a solution for some of these integration areas? So David, let me throw it over to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Rick, and thank you to the USIBC for having me on the panel. So I've worked for several years on renewable energy integration with both the central government and now more with the state governments. And I think some of the major barriers come down to the ability to plan for these resources. And there's been some great initiatives from the Indian government looking at renewable energy zones, where they've planned transmission out to these larger parks, and that's allowed those places to flourish in terms of being able to add a lot of renewables onto the grid. So I think those are the same lessons that we're learning in the U.S., where kind of the best example is down in Texas in the ERCOT area, where they came up with renewable energy zones and allowed wind to flourish. So I think that's been a really great initiative to do that in the early stages. I think states are still having some trouble figuring out exactly how to plan renewables into their grid, thinking of them as sometimes needing 100% backup. And so I think in a lot of cases, there needs to be kind of additional tools and methods and support for state utilities to be able to optimally plan and not think of this as having to build backup, and that just ends up being a costly way to build out renewables. And so I think that can ultimately get in the way of renewable energy growth in the future if we don't have those better methods in place.
Yeah. Stephen, let me throw the next question over to you. Again, kind of a gating question for, I think, a lot of companies that are looking to tap into the Indian market for the first time, or even Indian companies that sometimes are trying to understand, their own market, because every state is kind of a universe unto its own. But when you look at the interplay of how market rules, these constant rule changes that you see, how states go about their long-term planning, but offer micro changes in between, how do you look at the interplay of all these things? What kind of practical advice can you offer to companies, trying to study 28 different kind of things happening? Are there particular kind of initiatives that you look for, some that you think are more likely to be carried out for long periods of time, some that are likely to be tweaked maybe as new technologies are developed? So give us some thoughts in terms of how companies look at all these markets and think about strategy when rules are changing and adapting all the time.
Sure. So first, I wanted to say thanks, Rick, for inviting me. And I also feel like I'm sort of back home again. 11 years ago, the USIBC hosted a Green India conference. It was my first time visiting India. And little did I know that when I came back from that conference, I'd be talking with my wife about moving the family to India, so I have US IBC to thank for that. So first of all, thank you. And at that stage, there was 1 megawatt of grid connected solar in Delhi, and so that's so it's wonderful to see the improvement. I think companies that are familiar with working in the United States have a great framework for India in terms of market rule changes, because we all know that the United States is a patchwork of regulations, and so the India is much the same construct that as we heard from Mr. Soonee, that we have interconnection agreements or interconnection standards at the federal level, but then they have to be incorporated at the state level. And so how are they actually done? How do you handle net metering? How do you handle individual issues? Are as varied in India as they are in the US. Typically, what we recommend is that people get an anchor market. And so in the United States, the anchor market tends to be Cal ISO or PJM or New York ISO. And then look at what the differences are, how you compare from there. So in India, there are a lot of great markets that you can use as sort of anchor points to get your reference on what's the regulatory regime in that market. There are a lot of trends that I think are just long-term trends that can be invested in with large capital investment. And we see that in both energy storage and solar and just the overall cost structures. And so you don't want to overreact to short-term incentives that different states put out, but you can look at sort of the underlying economics that drive those policies and look to follow those underlying economics, such as, in California is a great reference example where you just have a huge ramp rate in the afternoon when the sun's going down. Well, there's going to be an overall long-term economic incentive for load shifting in that market. And how do you accommodate that type of peak? And some of those same fundamentals exist in India in high solar penetration markets.
I love that point. Some of my first work in India 22 years ago was resolving some of these payment problems from that kind of first wave of grid scale power generation. And many of those companies were lured in by specific incentive packages that different state governments offered. Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Maharashtra, of course, with Enron. And you find with a change in state government, sometimes those incentives weren't always kept up. And if the underlying market conditions were unfavorable and you couldn't sustain it without the incentives, you had a lost and landed project there that was difficult to climb back. So that's a terrific point that I think everybody should take heed of. David, as you know, we've been running this project to go and interview state governments across India and find out what are areas they want to build and improve on. Storage comes up constantly, and they're really looking for thoughtful advice because there's certain types of storage India's got some background and history with, like pump storage. But state governments tend to have relatively lightly staffed research departments, to say the least. And when they hear about new types of storage that are coming out there, sometimes they have a bit of a difficult time figuring out what's real and what's not, and sometimes paralyzed to kind of spend the money. So I wonder if you can talk about storage. Where is India at today? Are there favorable areas? What are areas you see India kind of leaning towards? So love to hear your thoughts on where storage is at and where it's going to.
Sure. So yeah, NREL is doing a storage study right now for the whole South Asia region. And part of that is because there's so much excitement. A lot of times when we start our presentations on storage, we start with a Google search about storage and the Holy Grail, because it is that level of excitement around energy storage. And I think in some cases that is coming to a reality a little bit. You'll see, I mean, in the American or in the US market, there's so much storage in the interconnection queue, especially in California, that it's really going to explode, and the costs are coming down at a rate that nobody really expected. I think that there is a little bit of a period in the US, and I think this is going to continue for several years, where everybody's trying to figure out what to do in terms of, there's federal regulations that come out, and those don't necessarily work exactly like they thought. They don't encourage storage as much as they thought they would, and everybody is doing different things. California is kind of coming up with different rules than Texas, than PJM. It's kind of a sandbox mode. And so they're kind of forming their own regulations to create equality for all resources to come on the grid, but they don't quite understand what storage could do or what it needs to succeed. And I think that it's similar in India, maybe at a little slower rate, because of what you said, where the utilities don't have the ability to do this research that the big markets like PJM do. But they're certainly interested. We've worked with several utilities in Delhi, where they're trying to figure out, what are the cost benefits of storage versus adding transformers at the distribution network, as well as on the procurement side. What is the value of storage? And that's the question that's going to happen for several years. And I suspect that as utilities start to bring storage online, they'll figure out that, oh, actually, we can use it for this, this, and this, which, everybody kind of knows, but figuring out how to actually do it is going to take some storage come online. And for some of these leading utilities in India, the Tatas and BSES utilities in Delhi, I think are kind of leading the way on this. They're probably going to figure out that it is very valuable in different places that they didn't quite expect. And I think everybody's going to be able to learn from that. And so I expect that to happen for the next several years. And certainly CEA has put this storage into their long-term plan for 2030. So I think that's something that they probably didn't think they were going to do a few years ago. So I think it's certainly on an upward trend, as everybody knows, and there's a lot to be learned. And I suspect it's going to continue to be a sandbox mode. Different states are figuring out different regulations that are going to allow it to succeed and be equal, with other things such as, gas that could provide sort of peaking things that batteries can. So it's going to be a learning experience.
Yeah, not to put too much pressure on David, but I'd say with like a lot of these interviews that we had with state governments, most of the time the only people that actually stop by their office and meet with the energy utilities, a lot of times are folks in the corporate side that are trying to sell a specific technology or solution. And a few states that we talked to were actually a little bit fed up with the constant sales calls because they just didn't feel that they were capable of kind of making a call on which technology was better than the other. So for all the companies on the line, keep an eye on David's forthcoming study, because that may end up and be used really practically by a lot of state governments. I'm so glad you're doing that, David. I think a lot of them are going to appreciate getting kind of a third person view on what makes sense. Stephen, if I can throw the ball over to you, going back to these interviews that we ran 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of state governments were concerned about distributed energy at the time because of Saubhagya. They were saying, look, if the central government is going to pay to bring a line to every home, how would a more expensive distributed renewable compare, even if the reliability is higher, but the price is going to be dramatically, lower for the grid? Now that Saubhagya is over, now that we know there's a lot of unmet needs, can you talk about how you see state governments kind of picking up the pieces and thinking about this again, in a more fulsome manner now that, this big program to try to bring a line out to every home, is over and there's still a lot of unmet needs?
Correct. So one of the fundamental things, and I think David probably finds this as well, is the needs are much greater than the distribution companies' bandwidth to be able to meet them, especially as you start getting out to hamlets and very remote areas. So when you're at grid edge type systems, looking at more innovative ways to solve this, whether it's often it's going to look like a combination of solar and storage, or solar and biomass, some other combination of resources to provide both voltage support as well as to provide that last mile of interconnection to some of these remote areas, and how distribution companies can recover in their distribution rates. The infrastructure cost of some of those microgrids is going to be, I think, an important part of the overall solution. I applaud David for what he's doing in terms of looking at the study. When Rahul Walawakar thinks on the phone, so I apologize ahead if I end up, saying something that isn't as smart as what he would say in my place. He was part of that original group with me. When we started talking about energy storage, there were a lot of questions, and realized that we just didn't have the manufacturing capacity in India. And so we started the India Energy Storage Alliance, in part to try to encourage different technologies and different stakeholders to come together to start talking about what does it require. And so we're excited to see some of the initiatives that are at the federal level, such as the 50 gigawatt manufacturing mission on energy storage, and trying to make in India more of that ecosystem. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for US companies to be able to, both on the technology side as well as on how do you better utilize those resources in the markets. And so I think distribution companies can figure out some of these things, but I think, like you said, the research and development capabilities of a lot of them are pretty weak. And if you try to use a energy storage device like you use a fossil generator, you will get a very small percentage of the overall value that the device can provide. So it will require new technologies, and it may require an outsourcing by utilities to third parties in best optimizing these resources. And so we think, again, there's a lot of opportunities both in AI, machine learning, and such to be able to better utilize these both at the end of the grid and edge of the grid, as well as co-located with renewable energy.
Yeah, good, good. I'm going to open it up in a couple of minutes to the audience for any questions that you may have. So you can go ahead and start typing things in and up. But I've got a couple of the questions that I want to pick the brain for both David and Stephen from. David, when we think about the distribution companies, obviously the central government is setting out these lofty targets in terms of renewable energy, including distributed home products and such. What is the role that discoms are going to play ultimately? I mean, you've got these announcements from Delhi, but what is the role in discoms on really kind of supporting meeting these targets on renewable energy? And are there some states that you see are more successful at it than others?
Well, yeah, I think it's worth saying that there are some states that have been extremely successful. If you look at Karnataka, I mean, they've hit renewable energy penetrations. The last I heard was 90% was about the record, but I suspect that's gone up since COVID. So, I mean, that's world leading. So I think there are some really kind of bright spots in India in terms of renewable integration and what they've been able to do. I think the role of distribution companies is really learning how to use these resources and plan for these resources so that we don't end up with a system that is not cost optimal. And so, what we've done with some utilities in Delhi is help them understand renewables can actually count toward capacity. It doesn't have to be, and that's a hard calculation. It's new. It's kind of rethinking the way you would plan your system for peak, where you have firm capacity, and so kind of simple things that have been figured out around in different markets. In the U.S., this is still new too. So I think making sure that we understand everything that renewable energy can do is an important part for utilities. Another thing we're looking at a little bit is that renewables can actually continue to be good grid partners, so they can provide ancillary services. And as you get to higher penetrations, you really need renewables to play those roles. And so, because there might not be anything else on the grid eventually. But these things are being kind of charted out, and I suspect that discoms are going to see this, and I think there's several discoms in India that are figuring all of this out. I think that'll trickle down. So, I'm optimistic, and I think there's, again, there are some places that are world leading in India, and I think they'll continue to do that.
Let me ask specifically on a couple of the pressure points, David, and I'm going to turn the same question over to Stephen as well. When you think about it, and I've heard a few stories, but I don't know if this is indicative of kind of wider narratives on this, but the ways the discoms would directly, either help or harm the ability, especially for distributed. This idea about maybe large companies, manufacturing units being among the first that could do it, but also because they pay relatively high electricity rates. State utilities don't want them leaving the grid necessarily. And then similarly, for consumer incentives, we've touched briefly on net metering. Do you see that, state governments and the discoms in particular, that there is kind of a pressure on industrial units on getting off the grid because of that? Do you see net metering and providing, a viable tariff, to provide the consumers that send electricity back in I wonder, David, if you can touch on what you've kind of seen in the market, and I want to ask the same thing from Stephen.
Sure, I could talk a little bit about kind of the technical side of that, where there are places, and this is the same goes in the U.S., where distribution companies are putting up barriers to distributed energy growth because they don't completely understand what it's going to do to their system. So they might put on, hosting capacity limits on certain distribution feeders. You might say, well, 30% seems like it won't harm our system, and ultimately that's really harmful because there are some, the way that rooftop typically goes is maybe one company or one residence will get rooftop, and then their neighbor will say, oh, that's a good idea, and so it might grow in a neighborhood very quickly. And having a lot on, we found is, that's controllable. That's, a lot of cases it can be over 100%, and those aren't issues, but you do have to have plans to be able to deal with that. So putting these artificial limits on it is certainly going to have a negative impact. We're trying to help several utilities come up with better numbers, not necessarily kind of a rule of thumb. So from the technical side, I think, it's a learning experience, but there are several people beyond us trying to help them with that.
Yeah, Stephen, I wonder if you can touch on the same kind of these tensions you see on the specific ways discoms would touch on distributed, for companies that might leave the grid, for consumers that want to have a viable net metering tariff. What have you kind of seen in the market?
Sure. So we work with a lot of larger end use customers that purchase power directly from IEX. We've been an India Energy Exchange member for years. And so a lot of them have looked at doing tie-ups with on-site solar. And one of the unintended consequences of putting in significant restrictions on feed-in tariffs for surplus power and net metering regulations is that it encourages then more energy storage on site. And so it actually reduces then even more consumption from the grid and from the distribution company. So we think there's a lot of good applications for industrial commercial customers, both on site in terms of the price spread between solar and storage compared to what the tariff rates are. We think that to most optimally, though, build out the system, it really would be advantageous both for distribution companies and for those larger end-use customers to work together to coordinate the utilization of the storage. As David said, there is economies of scale, so you will get sales forces and installers and other things focused on a certain market, certain geographic area to install solar in, and so it can happen relatively quickly at a distributed level. And so we, again, on the ground see a lot of movement. I think it'll happen first with C&I because they pay some of the highest rates of any customer class, but we think that there's a tremendous opportunity with residential customers and adoption. But the rules need to be worked out so that distribution companies are not fearful, and also that rate recovery is done in a way that they have surety of being able to recover the costs of their distribution systems.
Oh, good. Let me just mention something for the host, for Raghavendra. I just realized that I don't have a tab on here to see comments that are coming in. So I don't know if you were planning on handling questions. I've got one more that I'm going to throw out to the two panelists here, but just, as soon as this is over, just let me know how we're going to handle the Q&A period for things that come in from the audience, because I don't have the comment bar there. But let me ask about timeline, and I'll start with Stephen, and again, throw the same one over to David, since both of you have a lot of engagements with the right folks here. Timeline by which state governments that you might engage would like to see returns on investments they would make. Right now, the average state government in India has about a 40% re-election rate. And there's a lot of pressures on anything that's going to involve capital outlays and consumer satisfaction issues like that to see relatively quick returns. But sometimes these technologies we're talking about, it may take a few years before you're going to see commercial returns on them. When you sit down and speak with state governments, utilities, and other players that are active in this space, what do you think? I mean, is like this 5-year window where state governments need to see tangible returns in a short period of time because of those electoral pressures? Is that really a driving factor, or is this an area where maybe there is a bit more space to talk about 10, 15 years? And I should say, not simply talk about 10, 15 years, but where you see state governments ready to say that, maybe a tough decision, capital expenditures and that kind of stuff is going to take a little bit longer to kind of see those returns. So I wonder if you could talk about the time horizon, because I think for a lot of companies that are on this call too, that are going to sit down with utilities and talk about a technology, does it need to have a really quick turnaround, or do you think that there's a bit more space for longer turnaround? So let me start with Stephen on this one, and I'll ask David the same question, because I'm sure you both have had a few different hearings and experiences on this kind of question.
Yeah, so we tend to work mostly with the end users or the generation plants or those, as opposed to working with a lot of the state governments, or at least that's my personal experience. And I will say that certainly for the commercial sector, they want relatively quick turnarounds in terms of their investment.
Everybody wants a quick turn, yeah.
To learn for it. And so, and one of the nice things is currently with the prices falling as precipitously as they have, that there's lots of great opportunities for good returns on that side. In terms of state governments, I think there could be really innovative financing models, energy as a service, some of these things in terms of, especially around optimization of assets, that really could work to try to create quicker returns on some of the investments. Long-term rural end of grid type things directly affects and benefits their constituents day one with more access to reliable power. But sometimes that's difficult to try to champion and to get the word out as a reason why rates may need to go up. It's always easier to add a new regime of free power for groups of people. But that doesn't provide the distribution companies the revenue they need to grow.
Yeah, David, let me ask the same thing. Like in your conversations, what sort of a threshold are state governments and utilities willing to look at for kind of the return on investments they might make? Is it really narrow, like within an election cycle? Is it a bit longer? What's been your experience so far?
We don't talk about that a lot, to be completely honest. We're helping them plan transmission assets that are going to last decades. And so they're thinking in those terms. And I think it would be helpful to think about those terms when you think about new technologies as well. So ultimately, we're trying to help them come to some least cost optimal output. And I think that's the best they can do in terms of their rates and getting a return on investment. And so, I think ultimately that's kind of what they're thinking is we need to show that we're doing cost optimal planning, and that's these investments are many decades for us most of the time.
Yeah. Well, if they're not bringing it up, that's a good sign, because if it was kind of a rigid parameter, I'm sure you would have picked up some pretty strong signals. Raghavendra, yeah, let me ask, how's the best way to run Q&A since I don't have that window? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'll be happy to help, Rick. So we've got 2-3 questions now, in fact 4 or 5 questions. Dr. Winfrey Dam, if you're here, please come on camera. It's a very relevant question that you've asked, especially from the regulatory side. If you could put the question, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, my question would be especially for Mr. Soonee, what is required in India to increase the share of demand shift for peak shaving? So I think it's still the fast, cheapest option. And a little bit is going on in India, but as far as I'm concerned, it could be much more. So I assume you need far more market-driven incentive or opportunities for doing so. But please comment.
Is Mr. Soonee there? You are. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dam. Yes, the best and the cheapest is adjusting demand, and there is no doubt about it. I would first start from one spectrum and then come to the other side. First of all, in past, there are states which could invert their load curve, but that was forcefully. But now it has to be voluntary. That's the difference. But that inherent USP of flexibility exists in India is well proven. Shifting agriculture load, rostering municipality pumps, these are all well established, and that's first part. The second part about coming to the market Yes, first thing is that now real-time market is clearly giving us a price signal. At least it is roughly 3 times, and it's a very sharp, kinky price rise and every 15 minutes. And that's where there is a strong signal that we need to chop the hills and fill the valleys. There is no doubt about it. Then, as far as peaking is concerned, the existing plants itself were not peaking at that time. So now they are also getting the signal. Everybody, hydro, you look at the way they are coming up. And that's what will give signal to the storage also, the batteries also, that you have a very high price signal. And on the demand side, some proven techniques like time of the day or giving other incentives, that's all the field of regulators. They would be experimenting, I'm sure about it. But the peak to off-peak price has to still go up. The difference has to still go up for these things to be, because for industries or anybody to shift, it has a lot of other implications. But I'm sure people will work on this. But many of the states, if you look at their load profile, their peak load has started coming during noon hours. And that matches so well with solar, like Maharashtra. And more states are moving, their load curve is shifting. And we have seen it in COVID, the load curve, the peak is coming in the daytime, more during the daytime. So we will see a lot of changes in the load curve, some natural, some policy driven, some regulatory driven interventions, and some forced by the prices. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Dam. I can see Dipanshu Gupta from IVOCT. IVOCT is a solar power producer and a project developer. Dipanshu, if you can come online and ask your question. Or okay, I'll ask it on your behalf. With more and more RE integration with the grid, can it lead to any grid instability due to its being infirm in nature? Broadly, if we could answer it from the panel, we have already gone into some parts of it. But if you really look at the whole Indian grid, it's a very large, a very complex grid, so many states and all of that, every state's individual behavior and all of the resource behavior. Please go ahead.
Sure, I'll start off. I think certainly there are concerns that people are thinking about, and those are valid concerns. From our perspective, most of them have resulted in not being nearly as dramatic as people think, and they're certainly not insurmountable. I think inertia is a good kind of starting point, and Mr. Soonee brought this up, that there are people working on this, and they should understand it. But what they've found in the U.S. markets is that it's a huge concern when you're about 5% renewables, and then you get up to maybe 20, and all of a sudden it's not really as much as you thought it was going to be. And so I think a lot of these grid stability issues are maybe they've been figured out, essentially. Not that they don't need to be looked at by the people on specific grids and to be studied in detail, but they're not insurmountable, and they kind of tend to not be as big of a deal as people think. And there's ways to deal with that kind of on a shorter term than it takes to kind of plan a whole system, which you should be doing decades out. You can deal with some of those issues that come up in shorter time frame. So.
And I've also just seen India grid operators operate under much more challenging circumstances than a lot of their North American prevalent. So I do think that the ability to adjust and adapt for intermittent resources and be able to use them is something that India will actually be an innovator in, and will be someone that will likely come up with newer strategies and help in optimization of that. And certainly energy storage and those things can help in that. Better peaking resources can help with that. But actually, I think that India's well positioned for their operators to operate in a dynamic environment.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that, Stephen and David. There is one more question, and we are reaching our time limit. And just like grid operators, we'd like to, stick to the time limits and balance things.
Well done.
Yeah, the question really is about are distributed resources economical under the current, rules and regime? If so, where are they, and what can we really learn from them?
So yes, and it depends. So generally, there's many places in India where distributed resource will be economical. What resources, depends a lot on your usage of power. So does solar make sense? Do you have the rooftop space? Do you have space on your campus? Is it something that can be deployed and engineered? Can it be at a scale? How do you use power? How does your use of power line up with that? Will you need storage to contain it? What are the local regulations on feed-in tariffs or net metering? So there's a lot of locational questions that need to be answered. What's your contract demand versus, will you have to increase your contract demand versus your actual demand? So there's a lot of things that go into the play of that. But I think you will find more and more customers, the answer will be yes. And I think it will happen in a very fast time frame over the next few years, that more customers will be adopting some type of distributed generation.
Yeah, a couple of things I've seen, Raghavendra, on that, which is, the World Bank a year and a half ago put out a study talking about the economic improvements of rural livelihoods between getting access to electricity versus getting access to a reliable electricity. And there's a big jump, of course, when you get access to electricity, but a far larger jump for home income. So when you talk about the cost benefit analysis, obviously, if homes are going to have a lot more opportunity themselves too to make money by having access to more reliable electricity than what the grid can provide, that's certainly speaks in its favor. And similarly, the IDFC Institute in Bombay put out a study last year about the infrastructure impediments that small businesses across India face. And again, you well know that shutdowns in electricity and things like that for many hours a month, cause huge production slowdowns and shifts in India too. So, there's a growing book of quantitative evidence too, showing that whether you're a small business in an urban area, whether you're a rural business or something like that, the reliability that the grid in India oftentimes does not provide, if there's a more reliable method that's brought in and the price points aren't too dramatically different, there's a net impact that's pretty positive and easy to show.
Wait, David, you were saying?
So I agree with what Rick said, that the cost benefit analysis is difficult because it doesn't always come down to economics when you come to distributed resources. And we actually had to kind of build a whole model to try and understand what was going on with that, because at least in terms of residential adoption of rooftop photovoltaics, it didn't always work out that it was a better option economically for a household, but it might be a little bit more expensive. But it might be a draw for different reasons than just the economics of it. Looking at things like if people have college educations, if people subscribe to even certain magazines, they're more likely to adopt rooftop. So there's these things kind of going outside of the regular cost benefit analysis that I think drive a lot of rooftop PV, at least at the early stages. So.
Thank you for that, David. And just so that we can keep time, the Indian deviation rules, grid deviation rules allow us plus minus 10% without a penalty for renewable energy. And we are well within the deviation, right? So just to wrap it up, thank you so much, Rick, David, and Stephen, that you could join us. I'd like to thank our keynote speakers and the inaugural speaker. I'd like to thank Sharmila. I'd like to thank Mr. SK Soonee from POSOCO that they could join us this evening. Thank you so much, sirs. Thank you, Dr. Winfried Dam. Thank you, wonderful audience. You can see that, the audience has been so diverse, right from generators to power exchanges and government and regulators, everyone. Thank you so much for your presence over here. Really, I'm grateful that you could make it. I'd also like to thank Nisha Biswal, President USIBC, and Ambika Sharma, Managing Director USIBC India. Thank you so much for being the wind beneath the wings and having this particular set of events, this whole series, which is now drawing to an end. I'd like to thank the digital team, Jay Galish. I'd like to thank Lauren Diekman and Sid Mehra for their support for this particular event, and my colleagues Jahanvi and Abhishek Kishore and Aditya. Thank you so much. God bless everyone. We hope we can come out of these times much stronger, having learned much more. Have a wonderful weekend coming up. Have wonderful festivities, and thank you again.
Great.
Safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bless.